From the moment Mr. DeMarco saw the listing go up for the house next door, he couldn't resist. He'd never liked that old woman who'd lived there, always complaining about his yard and giving him nasty looks. But now she was finally gone. They'd found her in her bed a few months ago, and now her kids were selling off the house. This was his chance to snoop around her home, and he wasn't about to let it pass. At the open house, he slipped past the realtor with a polite nod and began exploring every room, making little mental notes to satisfy his nosiness. Then, at the top of the stairs, he spotted an urn, polished and gleaming, perched elegantly on a narrow table against the wall. It stood out from all the other kitschy old lady knickknacks. It had deep green and black enamel swirls that caught the light in mesmerizing patterns. Drawn to it, he leaned closer, admiring the craftsmanship. The thought of taking it flashed through his mind, a petty kind of revenge for all her nasty ways. But as he reached for it, he felt something, a pressure, weighing down on his hand. A powerful, cold presence surged through the air, pushing him backward. He staggered, nearly falling down the stairs as he reached out and gripped the handrail tightly. He glanced over his shoulder and froze. A dark, blurry figure hovered just over the realtor's shoulder at the base of the stairs. The realtor, oblivious, continued to show other guests around, smiling and gesturing, completely unaware of the entity beside her. Nobody else seemed to notice it either. Mr. DeMarco stood slack-jawed, staring as the shadow seemed to cling to the wall, its murky form twisting and curling toward the urn at the top of the stairs, almost as if guarding it. Terrified, he fled the house, not daring to look back. The next few nights were restless. He couldn't shake the memory of what he'd seen, and felt somehow that it had been aware of him, that it had shown itself to him alone that day. He worried it had followed him home. And then late one evening, as he dozed on the couch, his eyes fluttered open to the sound of scraping. Across the room, the shadow was there, pressed against the far wall, almost blending into the darkness, but unmistakably present. It was massive, a shifting, fluid blackness with no discernible face, only the sensation of eyes watching him, burning through him. It was malice personified. He sat up, horrified, as he reached to switch on a lamp, and the thing darted out of sight. Shaken, he tried to laugh it off as his imagination. It was just something from that foggy time between dreams and wakefulness. But the growing dread gnawed at him. A few nights later, he woke in the dead of night to the sensation of something cold pressing against his cheek. He blinked, disoriented, his body going stiff as he found himself staring into empty eye sockets hovering mere inches from his face. The shadow loomed so close, its outline writhing, dripping like ink across the ceiling above his bed, dripping down toward him like it wanted to engulf him. He scrambled off the bed and fell onto the floor, drenched in sweat, heart pounding so loud he couldn't hear anything else, and when he turned, the room was empty. On the third night, he woke from a nightmare, rattled and exhausted, and anger, not fear, washed over him. He threw open his bedroom door, glaring out into the darkness. "Fine," he yelled, voice cracking. "Do something. I'm not afraid of you." But the shadow didn't appear again, at least not that he could see. The following afternoon, the realtor knocked on his door. She stood on the front steps, flashing her best cheerful contract-sealing smile, and waited. Behind her, the sold sign was freshly hammered into the lawn of the house next door. She called out his name, knocking a few more times, and when he didn't answer, she let herself in. Inside, she found Mr. DeMarco slumped on the couch, utterly still, his face distorted with an expression of terror. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze softening with pity as she approached. Tucked under her arm, was the urn from next door. Setting it gently on his coffee table, she unscrewed the lid and stood back, letting the heavy, oppressive energy settle into the room. The dark figure, now a thin wisp, twisted from the ceiling and spiraled down, disappearing into the urn with a faint whisper of malice. She smiled to herself as she sealed the lid, tucking the urn back under her arm with a small, satisfied sigh. Humming a cheerful tune, she left his house, closing the door softly behind her. In the dim evening light, she returned to her car, pulling out a fresh for sale sign from the trunk, brushing dust from the bold letters. As she hammered it into Mr. DeMarco's lawn, she straightened, admiring her work. Another successful sale, and another happy client. Every time I had that dream, the house loomed a little larger. Nestled on a hill in the woods at twilight, it stood with a kind of presence that felt all-consuming. The fog was thick, and the trees stood like darkened sentries leading me forward, the heavy mist swirling and giving the fading light an eerie blue haze. The light from the house was strange. A blue glow filling the windows, a shade cold enough to freeze your breath, yet it called to me, night after night. I'd walk towards it, almost hypnotized. But then, as I neared the front steps, the voices would start. Children's voices, disembodied, floating through the air, urging me to turn back, pleading with me to run. Each time I'd ignore them an inch closer, until just before I'd reach the door, my vision would blur and I'd wake, always feeling like I'd been on the edge of something terrible. But years later, during a hike on a random autumn afternoon near my college, I saw it. The exact house from my dream. My feet froze mid-step, and I caught my breath as I took in the familiar sight before me. The fog, the trees casting the shadows, and the darkened sky. It was all here, just like in my dreams. The same blue glow spilled out from the windows, unnatural yet oddly comforting, as if it were waiting for me. I stared in awe, both terrified and inexplicably drawn. Seeing this place in the waking world was like seeing an old friend. I should have turned around. I felt it deep inside, gnawing at my bones. But curiosity clawed at me, pulling me forward. Then I heard them, the children. They appeared at the edge of the woods, faded and translucent, their wide eyes dark with fear, and their mouths open in silent screams. One raised her hand to stop me, but there was no hand, only part of an arm. I could feel her tears somehow, her desperate sadness. But I kept going, seeing them at the edges of the clearing, hiding in the trees, these broken spirits pleading with me to turn around. But their warnings only pushed me forward. Whatever was inside that house was waiting for me. I had to finally know what it was. I reached the door, my fingers trembling around the cold brass handle. Pulling it open, a rush of icy air hit me, strangely colder than the outdoors. As I stepped inside, the blue light overwhelmed me, a frigid brightness that almost blinded me. The whole house felt like it was vibrating, like there was a current humming through the walls. I took a few steps into the entryway, my footsteps muffled on the warped wooden floorboards that seemed to sink slightly beneath me. The air was thick, filled with a damp, earthy smell, and something sharper, metallic, like blood left to dry. Just ahead, the hallway stretched into darkness, but I could make out the source of the blue light spilling from the room at the end. Something nagged at me to move forward. With my heart pounding, I stepped past the threshold and into the far room. The light was coming from a strange, suspended chandelier in the center of the ceiling. It looked almost alive, Roots and branches twisted into a skeletal frame, each tip glowing with an unnatural blue light. As I looked up, something in the twisted vines began to shift and unfurl. A cold terror settled over me when I realized they weren't branches at all. They were arms. Hundreds of little arms extending from the twisted wood, fingers clutching and flexing as if grasping for something just out of reach. The sickly realization hit me as I noticed they were children's arms, and some of the hands were missing fingers, others were curled, gnarled as if in pain, severed and bound together to form this chandelier. To my horror, they moved, all of them, like they were alive. I felt a wave of nausea, the bile rising in my throat as I tried to back up, my eyes darting to the walls to escape the horror above me. But that was worse. The walls were covered in photographs, each image blown up large and covered in smudged fingertips, as though someone had touched them obsessively again and again. At first, they looked like framed family photos, scenes of people laughing with their children, couples holding hands as their children played. But the longer I looked, the more wrong they seemed. Every child's face in every photograph was turned just slightly away from the camera, as if caught mid-turn. Every eye was wide, every mouth open, their expressions frozen somewhere between shock and terror. They weren't happy moments. They were snapshots of kids in the instant before something horrible struck. I took a step forward, feeling dizzy, almost like the room was tilting. A dry, slithering sound sliced through the air. Soft and teasing, I felt the word, "stay," tickle my brain, drawn out and slow, like a sigh echoing from somewhere deep inside the house. I whipped around, scanning the room, but nothing was there, just the photos, and that horrifying chandelier of arms still writhing and clutching at the empty air. Then I heard a soft creak. My gaze fell to the floor in the far corner, where a hatch was set into the boards, barely visible. Someone was moving beneath it. I watched, frozen, as little fingers curled up from the gap, slipping through the edge of the hatch, dragging it open slowly. An eye appeared, staring up from the darkness below, wide and bloodshot, unblinking. The hand gripped the edge, and another eye surfaced, until a face I knew was staring up at me, half hidden by the shadows. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, locked in place by that unyielding, desperate gaze. I saw myself in that hatch, my own face as it looked years ago when I was a kid. The little mouth opened, croaking a raspy whisper, "Help me, before they come back." The air seemed to thicken, the light from the chandelier pulsing with a sudden urgency. The photographs on the wall shifted in the corners of my vision, and it was then I realized they were looking at me. Every face had turned, every eye following me, watching as child me in the hatch reached a trembling arm up toward me. Something slammed upstairs as heavy footsteps pounded against the floor. Whatever was above me was coming down fast. Panic shot through me, an animal instinct to flee. I stumbled back, my hand reaching blindly for the door, but child me gripped my ankle, pulling me down with a force I didn't think possible. I looked down, horrified, into my own desperate eyes, feeling my icy fingers clawing at my legs, scratching deeply into my skin. I saw the terror in my eyes as my little mouth hissed, "They're coming." In a wild panic, I kicked myself free, stumbling backwards through the hallway. The footsteps upstairs were crashing down the stairs now, closing in. As I ran, tearing my eyes from the eerie faces on the wall, the arms on the chandelier stretching down, reaching, almost close enough to grab me, as I made it to the door and yanked it open. I burst outside, slamming the door shut behind me, my chest heaving as I stumbled down the hill. The children's voices filled the air, soft and sorrowful. "You shouldn't have gone in. Now they'll find you." As I stumbled into the clearing, my head spinning, I looked back, half expecting to see someone or something chasing me. but the house was silent, shrouded in blue mist, the fog swallowing it whole. In the days that followed, I tried to push the memory away, convincing myself it had been some kind of hallucination. I didn't dare go back to that place. But every night since then, I hear it. The soft creak of the hatch door opening, the little fingers scraping at the edge of the floor, a desperate whisper in the darkness. And every night, I make it out of that house. But every night the steps on the stairs are faster, and one day I know I won't make it to that door in time. I remember how it started, the strange, unnerving signs that something was wrong with my neighbor. I'd moved into the small house with my 2 kids only a couple of weeks before, hoping for a fresh start. The neighborhood seemed quiet and family-oriented, but it wasn't long before Mr. Green, the older man who lived next door, began to make me uneasy. The first time I caught him watching us, he was standing by his living room window, unmoving, eyes fixed on me as I unloaded groceries from the car. I shrugged it off as harmless curiosity. He was just a lonely man, I told myself. I waved, but he didn't wave back. He just stood there, staring at us. Then a sickening grin spread on his face as he looked me up and down. But when his eyes followed my daughter with that same lecherous look, I knew I had to keep him away from us. I gave him a hard look and said a prayer for safety, shuffling my kids inside. After that, things really got going with the comments. Whenever he saw me outside, he'd mutter under his breath, calling me witch, or that other word that sounds like it. Once he even sneered at me, "You're poisoning the air, bringing your darkness here." I didn't respond, but I kept the kids inside even when the weather was nice. I wasn't much for confrontations, especially in front of my kids. One morning, my son mentioned that Mr. Green had approached him at the bus stop. "He asked if you did witchcraft," he said, looking worriedly at me. "He said witches put spells on people." I tried to keep my composure. I didn't want to scare them. I assured my son that Mr. Green was just a confused old man. The next morning, as the kids stepped out to get on the school bus, they pointed to a line of powder in front of the house. I kicked it away dismissively and sent them to wait for the bus. Once the bus had rounded the corner, I investigated further to find a ring of salt circling our yard, even sprinkled up on the windowsills and the back doorway, as though trying to contain or ward off something. It had to have been that weird old neighbor, which meant he was on my property, near our bedrooms while we slept. The sense of dread I was feeling about Mr. Green was starting to suffocate me. The following night, I jolted awake to the sound of a small explosion, followed by the pungent smell of gasoline. I ran to the window and saw my car in the driveway engulfed in angry, leaping flames, and standing beside it, his hands clutching a gas can, was Mr. Green. His face was twisted with fury, his eyes blazing with something darker than anger. He didn't even look up to see me watching at the window as he circled the car like it was some cursed idol. Terrified, I called the police. Firefighters and police were quick to respond, but the damage was done. My car was totaled. I watched as they handcuffed Mr. Green, who they'd found just standing there with the gas can, watching the flames. He was shouting that he was purging the evil. The officers didn't tell me much at first, only that he'd been ranting about my witchcraft, about how I'd bewitched him, trapping him in some obsessive spell. It wasn't until the next day, after they searched his house, that I learned just how deeply disturbed he was. Inside his home, they found notebooks filled with rambling passages about dark magic and bewitchment. He'd written my name hundreds of times next to detailed drawings of my face with empty eye sockets. He had a running list of my schedule, when my kids went to school, even times when he'd seen me watering the mums on my front step or taking out the trash. The worst part was a series of photographs pinned to a wall like some twisted shrine. Photos of me at the grocery store helping my kids with their backpacks, and pictures of my daughter. Every one of them had been sharpied with words like evil, burn, cleanse. The officers showed me only a few, but they said he'd amassed a collection spanning the weeks since I'd moved in. According to the notes they'd found, he blamed his issues on me. That I'd cursed him somehow when I avoided him, that I'd hexed and rejected him. He truly thought he was the victim, and I was something he needed to cleanse. We were lucky that night. He could have set fire to the house with us in it. But the terrifying realization that he'd been watching us, calculating and obsessing for weeks, that he'd believed I'd bewitched him somehow. Even now, I wake up sometimes to the phantom scent of gasoline and wonder what would have happened if I hadn't seen his lust and used such a powerful protection spell against him. I had the day off and needed a break from the chaos of work, so I decided to hike alone. It was a random Tuesday in November, a couple of weeks after Halloween, and the last of the leaves had fallen, leaving the trees bare and quiet. The trail was empty, and I barely heard a sound beyond the occasional caw of a crow and my boots on the fallen leaves. I started off at a familiar path in a dense stretch of woods, one I'd hiked dozens of times before, but something that day felt different. The air was thick with a damp chill, like the skies might open for rain, and a fog clung to the ground, winding through the trees and muffling my breathing. About a mile in, I noticed the first strange thing, a small bundle tied up in an old, tattered black cloth. It was carefully placed on a tree stump just off the path, almost like an offering. I paused, feeling a flicker of unease as I approached it. Looking around, there was nobody nearby. The cloth was wrapped tightly around something small, knotted with a cord, and painted in what looked like smeared red handprints, as though someone had grabbed it with bloody fingers. I untied the cord, my curiosity getting the better of me, and when I opened the bundle, I found a dead crow inside. Its feathers were matted, and its eyes were missing, leaving dark, hollow sockets staring back at me. Shaken, I dropped it and left it there, trying to convince myself it was some morbid Halloween prank. I continued faster up the trail, a creeping sense of dread making the bare trees seem closer, like they were leaning in. The forest had grown eerily still, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots on the brittle leaves. About a half-mile later, I came across another disturbing scene. A series of small, handmade dolls hanging from the low branches of a large tree. They were crudely fashioned with sticks and cloth, with heads made from knotted fabric scraps that had been smeared with a dark, rust-colored substance. Each doll had eyes drawn on it in jagged, messy ink lines, staring blankly ahead, their heads angled toward the path, as though they'd been positioned to watch anyone passing by. They made my skin crawl. These were too intentional to just be casual Halloween pranks. I suddenly felt like I was being watched by more than the dolls. Scanning around me, looking for who might have left these creepy dolls here, made me realize how exposed I was there on the trail. I took a deep breath, fighting the urge to turn around and head back, telling myself it was all just a coincidence, probably kids just screwing around in the forest to scare people. Plus, I didn't want to go back past that dead crow. A little further down the trail, I stumbled into the next bizarre discovery. A set of bones laid out in the shape of a pentagram. At first, I thought they were plastic bones, like Halloween leftovers, but as I looked closer, I realized the bones were arranged deliberately, The longer bones were carefully aligned, forming a perfect 5-pointed star, and smaller bones filled in the spaces between, set in a layer of dried leaves. The bones were bleached white, startlingly clean against the dark earth. I took a step back, disgusted that I'd walked right into the center of it. This was intentional. Someone had done this, and they'd done it here on a public hiking trail for someone like me to stumble into. All of this felt wrong. I scanned the trees, half expecting to see someone hiding, watching me get terrified. But there was nothing, just the stillness of the cold air and the encroaching fog swallowing up every sound. Finally, I forced myself to move, walking faster now, trying to put distance between myself and whatever grim ritual I'd stumbled upon. But no matter how quickly I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was keeping pace with me, shadowing me from just beyond the trees. Every few steps, I glanced back over my shoulder, expecting to catch a glimpse of movement in the thickening fog. And then, just when I thought I was finally in the clear, I heard a soft rustling up ahead. I slowed, peering down the trail, squinting through the gloom. Something was hanging from a tree branch just up the path. I didn't want to get any closer, but my feet moved on their own. As I approached, I saw it was another doll, bigger this time, dangling from a length of knotted rope. This one had been decorated with what looked like pieces of clothing, the faded, tattered scraps of a child's shirt tied around its tiny arms and legs. A chill settled over me as I recognized the idol's face, drawn with dark, jagged marks that were unmistakably eyes, a mouth, a hollow expression, and somehow I knew I was seeing myself reflected in that crude, cursed doll. The weight of the silence around me was suffocating, and I realized with a sick twist in my stomach that each strange discovery had been leading me deeper into the woods, farther from the path I knew and the safety of the main trail. I felt trapped, hemmed in by the trees and the terrible nagging suspicion that I was being watched, hunted even. Whoever had made these things, had left these markers, knew these woods better than I did, and they were leading me somewhere. With one last desperate look at that hanging doll, I turned and ran. The fog seemed to thicken, the forest blurring around me as I raced back, retracing my steps, barely daring to look back. And then I heard it. The crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig, footsteps that weren't my own, following me, keeping pace. I forced myself faster, my lungs burning, the blood pounding in my ears as I finally broke through the edge of the woods and stumbled back onto the gravel lot where I'd parked. As I fumbled with my car keys, I dared a glance back into the tree line. The fog was so thick now it was nearly opaque, shrouding whatever lay within. But I saw something standing just beyond the trees, a dark shadow, watching. It was too far to make out any details, but I could feel it staring, sharp and cold, piercing through the mist. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and peeled out of the parking lot. The image of that person hiding in the woods burned into my mind. I don't know who or what I saw out there, or why they left those terrifying breadcrumbs for me to find, but that last doll, the one with my own twisted face staring back at me, haunted my dreams for months. Hey guys, thanks for watching. Please subscribe for more weekly stories. If there are topics you'd like me to cover or stories you'd like to submit for me to read, please leave a comment and send them to my email address in the description. If you'd like to support my work, please give me a like, comment, and definitely share these stories with your friends. It really helps. You can also do some shopping at the Lady Grimm store. There's a link here as a QR code and in the description. Thanks again, and see you next week.